And in 1391, there was a great massacre in all the cities, the great cities in Spain, where the Jews were murdered, their children were murdered, their wives were murdered, and their lands and their property was stolen by other Spaniards. And so began what you could say is a plan that God had for moving the Jews out of Spain. The Jews weren't asked to leave yet, but there was a great fear amongst the remaining Jews in the land of Spain. Spain was still considered the second Zion, despite the persecution that came upon the Jews. But at the moment a Christian nation begins to attack the Jewish nation within it, so brings its own downfall. If we would look at that next slide, it was the Lord who put it into my mind to sail from here to the West Indies, Christopher Columbus. God put it into his mind to sail from here to the West Indies. In other words, the Holy Spirit searched out the deep things of God, God saying, I will not have my word broken or my covenant with my people Israel broken. And if there is not a Christian nation where they can reside in peace until I bring them back to their own nation, then I shall find another nation that will honor my covenant with Israel. So God put it into the mind of Christopher Columbus to sail from here to the West Indies. And one of the scriptures that he rested on is over in the book of Isaiah, where it says that the Lord sits on the circle of the earth. Well, that may be no great revelation to you, but it was a great revelation to the average man back then. That the earth was not flat, but round, as were all the bodies that were floating around in our little galaxy here. And God put it into his mind to do that. And Christopher Columbus's father was also a minister, a preacher. One of the things that happened with Christopher Columbus is that he was seeking to get monies to sail from here to the West Indies, and he discovered, as we all know today, the Americas. He discovered North and South America. The very same year that he discovered America was the very same year of the great expulsion of the Jews from the land of Spain. The persecution started back in the 1300s. There was a great massacre in 1391. Now in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. A mere 100 years later, God brought about a plan to give the Jews a second homeland. Amen. And in the very same year that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had a written edict in January of that year, which was to be carried out in June of that year, that all the Jews were to be forced out of Spain, or they were to change their religion and change their last names and practices accordingly. So no longer, again, it didn't just start in 1492, but 1492 was the great exodus, you could say, out of Spain. Now, many Spaniards today, living in Spain today, are of Jewish heritage, whether they know it or not. Many people that are Spaniard or Mexican in background, in part, may be Jewish in their heritage and not even know it. Because many of the Jews back in the 1300s and 1400s began to not only change their customs and their practices and their religion, but they changed their names as well. No longer were they Goldsmith and other names that would be identified as being a Jewish last name, but to avoid persecution would change the name to be something that sounded Spanish in nature. Understand that the Spaniards had not yet come to the Americas, so there was no Mexican race as we know it today at that time. All right, the only thing that we can say for the Mexican race back then, or the Hispanic race back then, is that the beginnings of what was about to occur began to occur when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Isn't it interesting that the very same year that they were expelled was the very same year that God found another piece of land for the Jews to reside on? Not their homeland, but another Zion for them in the meantime, until the ages and the fulfillment of the scriptures were to come to pass for Israel to be made a nation again, like it was on May 15th, 1948. Now, one of the things that began to happen with the Jews, many of the Jews went to other countries and were accepted into even Muslim countries. One of the Muslim kings at that time said, "How did King Ferdinand get to be so foolish as to take you out of his country for the prosperity that you bring to the nation of Spain?" So it was foolishness that if someone is prospering in your midst, you keep benefiting, if for no other reason but to get rich. You allow people that are going to prosper you to live in your midst. And you could see Satan's hand behind this whole thing. Now, at the time, Spain was the greatest not only military force in the world, but also had the greatest naval force in the world. And that's one of the reasons why Columbus went to Spain to inquire of getting ships and money. We see later on, just a short 100 years later, we see what happened to Spain in the Spanish Armada. When the Spanish Armada, all Spain had been growing impoverished over the next 100 years. So Spain cut down all of its forest, used up all of its wealth, taxed all of its people to the max, and went to building a massive armada, took all of the, you could say, the spoils and the riches of Spain to do it, to sail against England, to destroy England. Built the armada, the Queen of England found out about it, built the armada. The armada sailed into English waters and was destroyed by a great wind that kept their ships from coming to land within hours of them landing. Their ships sunk, their ships were burned. They destroyed one another I believe, the hand of God, and Spain ceased from that point on ever to be a superpower again because of what it did against the Jews. Wow. There are many good movies that you can get out there. We have some of these DVDs at home that actually talk about the Spanish Armada. You can get online and you can look for these things and play them for your children and yourself so you can see this history. It's done extremely well. So God found a brand new nation. And as we're going to talk about here in these future weeks to come, we're going to see that Jews blessed financially the early days of this country, funded the Revolutionary War. We have some books back in our library that you can purchase on that and find out more about that, those specific men that did that. Now, many Jews were converted to Christianity in Spain at that time. So many Spaniards today that are Christians today may still be of strict Jewish blood, but they did it to save their lives. Many of the Jews that were forced out of Spain would pay to get put on ships. Their money was taken. They would be put on ships, taken out to sea, and by order of the king and order of many other evil Christians, those Jews were thrown overboard out in the middle of the sea and never brought to any land at all, but merely they were merely killed and murdered out of what we saw happening in Germany prior to World War II. The biggest cry that came out of Germany in the late 20s and the early 30s is Germany was impoverished because of World War I. They had not yet got back on their feet, and they began to find fault and said, we need to have, number one, a pure race. There was a bunch of witchcraft being practiced in Germany at that time. Other people saw the Jews as taking all the money out of Germany, and they were prospering, and yet they didn't notice and see that Germany was prospering because of the Jews, not being impoverished because of the Jews. And then they began to have a revolt that was nothing more than racism against the Jewish nation within Germany and within all those other, what we'll call Eastern Bloc countries at that time. And as a result of it, the great persecution of the Jews arose not because of nationalism, not even because of racism, but because of envy of prosperity, saying that we will get our nation back on its feet financially if we will just get rid of the Jews. And history repeated itself once more. After the end of the war, half of Germany was behind barbed wire for 40 years, for putting Jews behind barbed wire for 4 years. Dogs were were put around Germany and Berlin so that Germans who wanted to escape could not escape for 40 years because of the dogs. The same dogs that were used to keep Jews in that they used to corner the Jews and persecute the Jews. Now those same living dogs are keeping themselves in. And now what we call the Eastern Bloc, or what we used to call the Eastern Bloc countries.